Hello, welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Dr. Alex Swenson Ridley. I'm really excited to be joined today by Corrina Bellizzi, who is an omega-3 expert and who pioneered the growth of Nordic naturals to over $100 million in annual sales. Given her concern for health of people and the planet, she shifted her focus from fish-sourced omegas to algae in 2016. And today she leads Orlo Nutrition, which is a new algae brand that features the world's finest carbon negative omega 3s. Orlo Nutrition grows their algae in pristine water in Iceland in a controlled environment, optimized with AI and principles of circularity. She hosts a podcast, Nutrition Without Compromise, covering health topics without compromising your ethics or the health of our home planet. So, Karina, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I'm honored to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to dive into this. And I have so many questions about omega-3s that I know I've gotten from clients and, had myself as a practitioner over the years and just a health conscious individual in the world. But first, I'd just love to know like how you got into this mission, because you're clearly on a mission on several layers with like planet sustainability and health. So,
Well, it's not necessarily the most direct path as many people.
mhm.
You don't necessarily decide. It kind of comes to you in moments, I think. I mean, I was a little hippie kid growing up in Southern Oregon that came to Silicon Valley and everybody was in tech, right? Like everybody's working at Facebook or whatever. And decided to go to college to study anthropology and wanted to understand people and cultures of the world. And ultimately, I think that what has driven my continued love for health and nutrition is the fact that I get to support people. One of the things that I didn't necessarily, I think through as I was pursuing my studies in undergrad was that, studying people of past who no longer exist, because I was going deep into archaeology, doesn't necessarily make the world a better place now. And so my first job out of college, I was like, oh gosh, I'm just kind of burnt out on school. I did the job. I graduated with honors. I was thinking about going to, graduate school, becoming an archaeologist, and I basically needed a break. I needed to pay the bills. And so I started working for a company in the natural health space called Draco Natural Products. They offered herbal extracts to companies that made finished goods. And so I got to dive into the research and how these different things can impact our health, and then thinking about what my impact could be if I was to stay focused instead of what happened more than 10,000 years ago, what's happening now, and supporting human nutrition, and ultimately fell in love with the industry. So I've been in the health and wellness space since I graduated college back in '98, essentially, and have spent the last 20 years officially working in the space of omega 3s. I somewhat fell into omegas. I was already passionate about the health and wellness space, about helping companies create healthier versions of products. But I was getting a little bit, I would say, disenchanted with some of the behind the scenes stuff that would happen that I was really privy to, right? Like companies formulating with lesser quality materials and putting just any product on the shelf with a slapping a label on it, et cetera, et cetera. And um, often replacing a higher quality material with a lower quality material. And sometimes I was selling the high quality material and they were marketing as if they were using the higher quality material, but they were using something else. And so I made the choice in this really integrated way to say, maybe I don't want to be on the raw material supply side. Maybe I want to work for a company that is facing to the consumer, where I can have a direct impact on the materials we use, what is actually included, create quality products, and be in that space where I have the confidence to sit there and say, I'm making these recommendations for products that you can take to improve your health, and I know the quality, and I can stand behind that. And so I made the pivot of working kind of behind the scenes to working in this consumer facing capacity, and joined Nordic Naturals back in 2002. So for 10 years, really dove deep into the research on omega 3s and creating quality products that were better than other omega products that were out there, that were providing a direct source of EPA and DHA, not just alpha linolenic oil from flax oil or walnut seeds or whatever else, walnut seeds. I should say walnuts, chia seeds. I kind of
See,
mix
yeah.
these things together sometimes in my brain.
Awesome.
Perhaps I need to take more omegas. But I'm really being able to dive deep into that research. I fell in love with omega-3 because I learned how many areas of health that these particular fats, EPA and DHA, can impact. At the same time, I was deeply steeped in the fish oil side of the world. I started to become increasingly concerned with the health of our oceans. I'm a scuba diver. I was witnessing firsthand changes in coral reefs and changes in the oceans that I liked to dive in, even the Monterey Bay here in California, which is one of the most thriving ecosystems that we have. Um, you notice changes when you visit it often, when you're spending time in the underwater world. You notice that there might be less kelp this season, or that there seem to be more purple urchins that are eating their rootstocks and then they're drifting away, things along these lines. So I spent some time at connecting with people at MBARI, which is the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute, and they shared with me some stark figures that I at the time barely understood about things like how the acidity of our oceans is increasing, and with the rise in acidity of the oceans, we will get to a point where the ocean no longer supports life.
Mm.
And so that's a really scary thought, right?
Yeah.
I started to pivot my work life at that point to thinking about what we could do with algae instead, because algae at least supplied a direct source of DHA, which is so impactful for our health because it's involved in half of the fat in our brain and eyes. It is
Yeah.
half of the fat in our brain and eyes, ideally. If we don't get
Hmm.
enough, we'll make
No.
the brain and eyes out of other fats, and we can talk about all the challenges that creates, but ideally,
Yeah.
half the fat in your brain and eyes. So at least DHA was available then. So I started to push for more algae products and really try to educate people about the benefits of taking an algae oil being the same as taking a fish oil.
Yeah.
Because you'll hear about it in media pretty constantly. Doctors say, oh, take your omega-3s, and then the next word is fish oil, right?
Right.
We really don't need to go directly to the fish because the fish get their omega-3s from algae. And so long as we're able to harness the DHA and the EPA from algae, we now basically don't need to go to fish. And that's the world we're in now. There have been technological leaps that have enabled us to isolate both EPA and DHA from different strains of algae. And really what we're working towards with my collaboration at Baxa Technologies and the creation of the Orlo brand is bringing forward something that both is markedly sustainable, that has documented to ultimately be carbon neutral, at the same time that also produces EPA and DHA, or provides EPA and DHA, and in a polar lipid form, so it's more absorbable than the omegas you would
Mm.
even get from fish. And so this is a long kind of circuitous path that led me to this moment. But I've been working on this project for the last couple of years. The brand has only just become available in May of 2022. We've
Okay.
sold through our
You're
pilot
new.
batch and we're finally in our first full production run. And
Yeah.
as we prepare to launch the brand beyond our own website into other marketplaces. So
Awesome.
yeah,
So
it's a pretty pivotal moment, at least.
yeah, yeah. No, it sounds like it and really exciting. Um, on some of the levels, there's like so many places we can go. I just wanted to dive into because I live in Alaska. Listeners know that. My husband's Alaska native, and so one of the things that we've been dealing with, like his village is kind of way up the Yukon on the Canadian border, and salmon haven't been making the run because they're being overfished. Like there's so much going on in our oceans, and it's just like such a so I just wanted to kind of like acknowledge that for a
Yeah,
moment. And
it's
I know there's
it's
lots of
it's
yeah,
really scary. I mean,
it is.
and it's really sad. So, I mean, I want to take a moment to help people understand why it's so scary and sad. Because I've also been up to Alaska into the Kenai Peninsula. I've connected with fishermen that are local there. While I was at Nordic Naturals, we had for a while this product that was called Kenai Wild Alaskan Salmon Oil, right? And you know, at that time, and this is over 10 years ago, the fish were still flourishing, I could say, at least in that environment. Um, it was one of the best managed fisheries, at least as far as the Marine Stewardship Council and Friends of the Sea would acknowledge. But yet, at the same time, there were early signs that there were problems. Like, for instance, the fish not going as far inland or as far upstream as they used to. And what people may not understand is that if the fish don't make it as far inland as they used to, their bodies also don't feed the forest because the bodies of the fish decompose. They go into the waters, other animals eat them, they feed the microbes that are in the soil, they feed the trees, they feed the floodlands. I mean, it ultimately, they're part of an ecosystem that needs to be respected and protected. And so with a rise in popularity of omega-3s, we've continued to go to the oceans and, reap them for a harvest. And ultimately, with salmon being the preferred fish, we're at a spot now where scientists have come into the fold and said, okay, we're going to genetically engineer salmon that are going to outgrow traditional wild salmon, that will double their weight in a matter of weeks, that will become um, basically more capable of surviving on less feed and get bigger and produce more omegas in a shorter time. So they're genetically engineered to do this. They've been dubbed in some circles the Frankenfish. But
Yeah.
the reason that I was so against their use and ultimately their farming is related to one clear thing, and that is that they are generally farmed in open ocean in these ringed pens, and there are always issues of escape. Fish always escape some of these nets. They can jump into the air. There can be a hole in the net at the bottom. The nets are generally moved from spot to spot, these open rings. And the reason they do that is so that the fish are less likely to get sea lice and other gross parasites that attach to them and impede
Mm.
their life cycle. So they move the open water rings into other spots so that they're not just sitting over this column of waste for a long time, right?
Okay.
Um, so when these frankenfish escape, because they do and they will,
Hmm.
um, they they could potentially supplant wild populations and outcompete them because they grow faster, they survive on less food. They also don't have the genetic memory of going to that prior spawning ground. And so
Yeah.
what happens now to the entire ecosystem as it relates to the salmon's part in that? And that is a scary future. It's one of these instances where I think we as a people, we make a plan. We say, oh, well, this is great. We're going to go ahead and do it. But we don't consider the consequences. We don't
Yeah.
necessarily understand what the cascade of either problems or benefits could be from that, because there could be a cascade of benefits too if we do things better and we do things right.
Yeah.
So ultimately, I'm concerned for the health of fisheries around the globe. I'm concerned for the health of the ocean. I think that we all need to be thinking about where we get our nutrition, and ultimately, what goes into its production. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
And a lot of people don't think about that. I think one of the most eye-opening experiences I've had was I went to school in Colorado, Colorado College, and one of my friends, her family owned a cattle ranch in Wyoming. So we went up there and they had free range cattle, but we could see the feedlots on like all around them. And it's just this brown blob. And like people don't think like we don't really think about beyond, oh, that comes from the store. Like, no, it came from somewhere before it got to the store. And what is the process that got it there? So I'm
Right.
glad that you're
Yeah. Concentrated animal farming
bringing
operations,
that.
or CAFOs is what they're called.
Yeah.
And sometimes this is the sad truth too. So even if you're really working and you're trying to be a more responsible citizen, right? You want to
Hmm.
buy from regeneratively grown organic meat, that is grass fed and also grass finished. And so you're buying from a producer that you think is doing all those things. Often the reality is that that producer then contracts with CAFOs for its last end of life, so to speak. So
Yeah.
it could have spent this beauteous life doing whatever, and then is temporarily shuttled to this basic hell for the animal, where
Yeah.
they're all resting, they're standing on their own piles of dung, basically, and then have that end of life experience. It's basically the same as all those animals that aren't raised that way. So I think while it's painful and difficult to become informed, I think it's important that we take just a little bit more commitment to understanding where our food comes from and working to collaborate with and support those that are doing so more responsibly. I'm an omnivore. I happen to work with a company that is producing vegan and vegetarian products exclusively. I happen to believe that we should shift more of our overall perspectives to being a plant-based
Yeah.
sort of diet with meat still consumed, but in a more mindful way. Um, and I would call myself kind of a reluctant omnivore, because if I could get everything that I needed and ultimately craved and desired from non-animal based products, I would, especially given how our farming operations are today. But
Yeah.
I need more protein than I can get personally from the vegetarian foods that I consume.
Hmm.
And I'm also sensitive to soy. So a lot of those foods that you might say, oh, we'll just go to that, I can't,
Yeah.
right?
Right. Yeah.
So that's a reality for many people. We have overconsumed soy for a long time, so people develop allergies. And it may not have been an allergy that existed in a prior generation for that reason.
Yeah. And it's also one of those crops that's cheap, and so we've done some
Heavily
massive things to it.
subsidized. It's
Yeah.
cheap because it's heavily subsidized.
Yeah. I had a friend in chiropractic school who's Chinese, and he couldn't eat Chinese food here because he was allergic to our soy. So his parents actually would ship him like what he needed to make his own food and stuff because he couldn't eat American
It's not
any like
surprising.
Asian food.
And
So
so many of my friends also, I've had several report that they can't eat wheat products here, but they go to Europe
mhm.
and they can. And
Yeah,
specifically Italy, like they can eat pasta just fine in Italy,
yeah,
but they can't eat it here. And it has to do with, I think, glyphosate exposure.
yes.
Glyphosate, sorry, not glyphosate.
Yeah.
I always want to put an F sound after the,
I think I do too. And for those who aren't familiar, this is like what's in Roundup, which is the main, weed killer and
yeah,
all that.
Monsanto,
Mhm.
Monsanto, now Bayer.
Yeah.
So Bayer bought Monsanto. So the same
Oh,
company that makes, ibuprofen
yeah. That's exciting. So, all
appropriately.
right. So we've got the state of the world, right? And I know even from when before we started recording. So like first let's get into why are omega-3s important for our health. There's like a whole list of reasons, but let's break it down.
First and foremost, omega-3s are included in every single cell in your body. And so when you gain an understanding of that, this is why they start to sound like snake oil. And frankly, snake oil has omega-3s in it. So perhaps there is something to that, right? So you really have to think about the fact that cells work a specific way. They essentially are able to transmit nutrients. They are able to communicate cell to cell. They are able to eliminate toxins. And when you don't have healthy cells, when you make up your cells of other fats that happen to be present in your diet, they might not do the things that you want them to do. They may not do it as well. And one area in which they are pivotally important is brain health.
Yep.
So if you want to have a clear mind, if you want to make sure that you've got a healthy mood, if you want to ensure that you also have, generally speaking, clear vision and things along those lines, you need to be making sure that you're getting enough omega-3 into your diet. And we're not just talking about alpha-linolenic acid or the flax oil or the, so it's flax oil, chia seeds, walnuts. These are the common higher in omega-3 plant sources that you might find. You really need to go directly to EPA and DHA. And I can break down quickly why that is, if you think that would
Yeah,
be
yeah,
helpful.
let's do it. I know lots I'm interested in this and lots of other people have asked me questions about it. So let's do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So basically, if you were to consume omega-3s from these other plant sources, not direct sources of EPA and DHA, your body has to actually go through several enzymatic processes to break the alpha linolenic acid down and then essentially rebuild it into a DHA, which is 20 carbons long, 22 carbons long, or EPA, which is 20 carbons long, right? And so you end up having to go through, I would call it an expensive process in your body.
Yeah.
And the reason that it's thwarted sometimes has to do with the fact that you also use those same enzymes to break down omega-6s.
Mm.
And so omega-6s are present in your diet and animal meats and things like eggs too, right?
Yep.
And all of your seed oils, so corn oil, soybean oil, canola oil, all of those oils are much, much higher in omega-6.
Mhm.
They actually in nature also have omega-3 present, but that's refined out of them because it's not as shelf stable. And so we get oils on the shelf to cook with that are almost completely omega-6 and not omega-3 at all. We consume them in our baked goods, we consume them in our fried goods, we consume them in our chips and cupcakes. I mean, they're in everything. And
Yeah.
so ultimately, your body is competing for these enzymes to break down that other healthy plant source of omega-3 into EPA and DHA. And then there's one more factor that makes it all nearly impossible to get to where you want to be. And that is that we consume trans fats. And trans
Yep.
fats are partially hydrogenated or fully hydrogenated oils. They are present in many foods that you see on the shelf, processed foods, anything from crackers to chips to canned goods. And they are essentially one molecule away from being plastic.
Mm.
So if you were to open a jar of shortening or your margarine and put it out in your garage on a hot sunny day, um, not a single insect will move over to it. Not a fly, nothing. They're not going to go for it. But if you do the same with butter, they're there. They're
Yeah.
buzzing around your head. They're going for the butter because it's food.
Mhm.
And unfortunately, we as a species, we don't identify that it's not a food like the animals don't. We ingest it thinking, oh, it tastes good. It's nice and salty. It's crisp. It's sweet. It's all these great things. We consume it, and our bodies don't know really what to do with it. And so essentially what it does is it gunks up the system. It shuts down our ability to actually use the enzymes that we would to integrate these healthy fats into our system to create the EPA and DHA our body needs. And so going to plant sources of omega-3s that are not algae based is problematic. So that's where I would just say get something that's a direct source of EPA and DHA. Algae can produce that. You don't need to go to the fish because the fish get it from the algae they eat anyway. Um, and ultimately, if you're looking at why it's so important that we balance these two things, they're like opposite sides of a teeter-totter. And our body needs to be in balance in order to be its healthiest. We need to recover from inflammatory events like stubbing your toe or having some sort of issue in the body where you cut yourself or something like that. You need inflammation to heal. It's absolutely critical. But your body also needs to return to normal or to baseline after that event. And if you don't have a balance of omega-3s to omega-6s in your system, what happens is that inflammatory loop can kind of spin out of control. You can take a lot longer to heal. This is actually connected long term to things like development of arthritic conditions or skin lesions. This is one of the reasons that consuming enough omega-3s seems to positively impact skin health, conditions like psoriasis or rosacea, because really it's not that the omega-3 is a drug that is treating these things. It's that you're putting your body back in balance so that it can heal, so that it can return to homeostasis, so that that out of control inflammation can be quashed. And so I don't want people to think of it like a drug because it's not a drug. It's really just giving your body the nutrition it needs to function optimally.
Yeah. Which is key because I get this question a lot, and it's like, well, what supplements am I supposed to take? Because, like my mom is an example. She's 72 and she doesn't eat, she just takes supplements. And I'm like, okay, that's not living. Like you have to actually consume food as well. And, and then and I think omega 3s have kind of gotten couched in behind marketing the same way that dairy did. Like, cow's milk is your only source of calcium, right? Like we all have been raised to believe that. And that's total BS. Like green leafy vegetables, have far more calcium than cow's milk ever will. But same with omega 3s, like it's been, oh, just eat more fish, or get it has to come from fish, as you've been saying. And it really doesn't. And there's what I'm getting to is, there's essential things that we are lacking in our diet because of everything you just said, because it's all processed, because it's super high in omega 6, or yeah, omega 6s. And when we're out of balance with those, all kinds of fun happens.
Yeah.
Dementia,
And
heart
the
disease.
pill can't be a
Like,
magic bullet either. Like we need
yeah,
to address our overconsumption of certain things. And one of the quickest ways to do that is to stop eating processed food. And perhaps
right.
not all processed food, because even olive oil is a processed food, right? But highly processed foods.
Yeah,
If it comes in a box and it has a label ingredient list that's like this long, and I'm holding
yeah,
my fingers up to say almost as far as my thumb and forefinger will go, I mean, maybe don't eat that. Consider it not a food. You might, be able to convince your dog to eat it because they want to eat everything you do, but it doesn't mean that it's healthy for them or for you.
yeah,
So if we can get to a point where we're actually addressing our body's nutrient needs, then suddenly all sorts of positive things happen. Like you can balance your hormones. People will see stubborn weight fall off their bodies for multiple reasons. I was actually talking to a prior collaborator, Stuart Tomk, about this on my other podcast, Nutrition Without Compromise. And he and I were diving into the research behind the reason omega 6 and omega 3 balance is so critical for things like healthy weight, as it relates specifically to triggering our hunger mechanisms. And
yeah,
what they find in animal studies is that when they feed animals high omega 6 diets, they eat more, like a lot more.
yeah,
And when they feed them a balanced diet that has omega 6 and omega 3 in it, they eat less. And guess what? They're not as fat. I mean, it's just that simple. So it's like they're not feeling starved. They're given supply of the same amount of food. They just don't sit there and, constantly feed on that chip bag. So it's like
yeah,
those snack foods are essentially engineered to make us want more. And there's a reason, biochemical reason, that you don't get full eating them. I can sit there and eat an entire bag of buttered popcorn, that's got who knows how many calories from omega 6 at the movie theater or whatever. Like it's
right,
all going to
yeah,
be trans fats and omega 6s. There's no
yeah,
omega 3s in that. You
mhm,
can eat the whole thing, no problem, and not be full because you've got the salt, you've got the magic of the sugar from the corn, and at the same time, you have all of this omega 6.
yeah. So I'm curious from your perspective, because I learned, about ratios and all this stuff like probably 10 years ago. What is the ratio that we strive for? Because I know it's skewed way high in terms of omega 6 at this point. But like, is there a number, or is there like
Yeah, the
we
current
all know?
literature says that we are generally consuming about 15 to 20 times more omega 6 than omega 3
Mhm,
as a culture. I would argue that depending on who you measure that with, I mean, there are some people who just don't consume omega 3 really at all. And so it's not surprising to me that we would have all sorts of disorders kind of erupt, like, mood, brain health, eye health, skin conditions, heart disease, Alzheimer's, all of these things. It just follows. You're not getting a balanced diet. But really, scientists have tended to say that our ideal balance, at least through evolutionary times, up until we got to the point where we were engineering foods, was somewhere in the realm of 1 to 1 to 3 to 1.
yeah,
And so that would be 1 part omega 6 to 1 part omega 3,
mm,
or 3 parts omega 6 to 1 part omega 3. And it's really impossible for us to go back and see because we can't test, what did the reindeer and the buffalo have before, Western man came over and claimed that this was India or whatever.
Right.
It's like, this is, we can't go back to that moment and test it, but we can get a fairly good idea. And we know that if you're consuming wild meats, that they are more balanced with their omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. And typically that's more like a 3 to 1, right? We know that if you're eating whole grains as opposed to oils or seed oils, that you're getting a better balance of omega-6s to omega-3s. We know that if you were consuming fish, you were getting much more omega-3 than omega-6 in that particular food. And much of human evolution, as I go back to my archaeological history, happened along seaboards and waterways.
Right.
That's where we stayed. We needed water, we needed salt, we needed seafood in order
Mm.
to build our big fat heads. So that's
Yeah.
essentially how we evolved.
Yeah. Well, and I think, and maybe I don't know if you know this or have answers to this or not. I've kind of been exposed to some of the blue zone research, right? And
Mhm.
for those listening, like the blue zones are the area, there's 7 areas of the world. There might be nine. I think it's seven where people consistently live over 100. And so they've looked
Yeah.
at like, and they don't just like, they actually live like they're not
More
just,
centenarians, they're healthier,
yeah,
their health span is much greater. They
yeah.
tend to have a slower lifestyle than we have, in my
Hmm.
town, as a for instance, where
Yeah.
the family units are more together, less
Mhm.
disparate, less spread out. Um, and that seems to be a healthier way to live, generally speaking.
Yeah.
They
And
tend
I'm
to eat
curious
more
if
seafood.
if they've done any studies on the omega ratios between sixes and threes with them, because I'm assuming that they're, I
Yeah,
mean, I know
generally
there's an area in
speaking,
Japan where they eat plenty of seafood and so
yeah,
they have.
that's actually what Omega Quant based their blood spot analysis off of. And
Hmm.
so they say that generally speaking, they want to see you closer to an 8% of your tissue is made up of omega-3, and they can test that through blood spot, right?
Yeah.
And so if you're in some of the blue zones of Japan, and we're not talking Tokyo necessarily, we're talking
Right.
more like kind of off into the countryside where people are actually living slower and exposed to less harmful pollutants, and also
Yeah.
eating a more traditional Japanese diet that isn't as impacted by the arrival of KFC and McDonald's, right?
Right.
So, um, yeah, I have a story there because my niece, she actually lived in Japan in her teen years, and she got a job at Abercrombie and Fitch as a greeter and was paid $36 an hour to just go, "Hey, how's it going?"
Wow.
Can you imagine? This is
Yeah.
the
No. No.
infiltration of
Well.
our culture
Yeah.
into the East, but I think
Yeah.
she'd be tickled to
Okay.
hear me say that. But really the spots around the globe that are noted as blue zones also tend to have a more balanced diet where you do see more whole foods, and I think that is very important. Whole foods where they're consuming things like what you see in the plate in the background on that side. Yeah, I've
Yeah.
got the mirror image up. So um,
No worries.
it's a whole foods based diet. So you're actually making and preparing the food as opposed to just taking something from a box and throwing it in your microwave oven to later consume.
Yeah.
Yeah.
By that point, it's not food. So, you know,
Some of the not foods are delicious. I think that's part
there.
of the problem.
Yeah. And we as the consumers and eaters have to recognize like a lot of them have been engineered to make us want more and to think that that's food. Like
Yeah.
I actually had a when I got married to my husband, I have three stepsons, and we had like a big argument because I started cleaning out their pantry, and my husband doesn't know how to cook, so they've literally been living on boxed foods for the 3 years that he was a single dad, and I got rid of their margarine, and they were like so pissed at me. They were like, "No, I want my fake butter." I was like,
I can't believe it's not butter. Right.
"Yeah, I'm sorry, but no, I'm not eating that, and you guys aren't either." So,
Well, it's
you know,
funny. My first trip up into Canada, I learned that margarine, they don't allow you to add colorant to it because it's actually against the law in Canada to add colorant to margarine. And the reason they do that is so that people can easily discern margarine from butter if they are dining out, as for instance, because the butter will have
yeah,
a yellowish hue and the margarine
mhm,
just looks white.
that's very interesting. And it's so interesting to just look at the U.S. versus other westernized nations, and these problems are still rampant there as well, I think. But I know Europe doesn't allow trans fats, or at least they didn't like 20 years ago. I've heard it's changing for the worse, unfortunately. But
Well, what I'm so perplexed by is that
yeah.
there are so many products out there that say on the label 0 grams trans fats, 0 grams.
Right.
And then you look
But
in the ingredients and it
and
says
they have
partially
partially
hydrogenated
hydrogenated.
or fully hydrogenated soybean and or palm kernel oil. And
Yeah.
so now I've been triggered in multiple ways. For one, you're lying. I mean, even if it
Hmm.
is a quarter of a gram, it's still trans fats, right?
Yeah.
And for two, you're actually using palm kernel oil, which is contributing to deforestation in Borneo and habitat loss of the orangutan. And
Yeah.
so I personally make choices when I go out grocery shopping not to purchase products that have palm kernel oil in them, including my peanut butters, which is sometimes hard to find even
Yeah.
on the more natural and organic side. So,
Yeah.
I have resorted oftentimes to just making my own peanut butter because I can just take peanuts and throw some salt in it and a little bit of honey if I want to sweeten it up, grind it
Hmm.
up, and it's good to go.
Yeah. And yeah, there's a time and a place for that. And that was the other thing I wanted to talk about was, supplement quality. And because you've obviously been exposed to this in a way that like most people are not. And I know as a when I was doing more functional medicine, and I still do some of that, but I've moved more into the coaching world now. But I found one company that it's annoying because they'll run out of things, but they run out of things because they're really committed to where they source them from. And I'm like, I would rather deal with that than, have some adulterated version of the product that's not really what it was, you know, started out as or was made to be. And with one of them, they couldn't source it anymore. So they actually just created something totally new that was more sustainable and sourceable. It just sounds like it's what you have done. Um, and we can definitely talk about your product, but I'm just curious, for those listening, because I get, people are like, oh, I'll just buy the, Centrum vitamins or whatever, wherever. Like, please don't. That's my
I mean, and this is a hard subject because
yeah,
ultimately there are people out there who will say, oh, supplements are unregulated. That's not true. Supplements are regulated. We're regulated by the FDA. The Dietary Supplements Health and Education Act of 1994 stated that the FDA could regulate supplements. Since that time, we can't bring in new dietary ingredients without essentially going through the same rigors as a drug company would to produce an over-the-counter drug. So there's a lot of regulation in place. Supplements are not underregulated drugs; they're highly regulated foods. That being said, there is a complete range of quality of ingredients that are available in the marketplace, and in many cases, those ingredients are not necessarily in their most absorbable form. So, for instance, you go to a Centrum, you decide, I'm going to take this multivitamin every day because I was told by my doctor that I should take a multivitamin and an omega 3. So, I'm going to go out and buy that. And it's cheap, it's available at my grocery store. And what they may be buying is expensive excrement. And I say that because even though it might only be $5 a bottle, you're throwing into your body ingredients that are in the highly processed synthetic form. You aren't going to get you might be getting vitamin D3 now. Like they might have made that upgrade, but they're not going to give you the methylated form of any of the B vitamins. So you may just end up ultimately peeing it out. It's not doing anything for you. They're not going to give you the most absorbable form of calcium or magnesium. And so these things might actually cause you a little digestive distress. They're not going to have given you the highest quality of anything because they essentially couldn't afford to for the price. And so, you have to think about those purchases as investments. And so when I look at something like a supplement, I'm looking at, is this worth it? And is it quality? So if I'm going to find an omega 3, I'm looking for something that is going to be in its most bioavailable form. And for that, I caution people to look at polar lipids because phospholipids and glycolipids, your body automatically recognizes as part of its cells, essentially. So when you consume them, with or without food, any time of day, you can actually absorb them. I recently learned that I have a genome type called ApoE4. I have one representation of ApoE4. And what this means is I drew a short straw, okay? I don't have the best chance at living the longest, healthiest life, Alzheimer free, unless I'm smart about how I live, right? And this is the epigenetic contribution, right? I can actually consume the right things, support my body along with the other 15% of the population that has at least one representation of ApoE4 in the hope that I won't develop Alzheimer's disease or dementia later in life, like my grandmother had, right? So having this genome type, I may be less likely to be able to integrate omega-3s. And this is the thing I've learned literally in the last few weeks. But guess what? A polar lipid form of the omega-3 is going to get to my brain. So it may be serendipitous that I ended up shifting my focus from being on the fish oil side, offering triglyceride fish oils, into specifically and only working in the algae space. At the same time, I learned that I have this ApoE4 genome type, and also that I may be less likely to integrate the omegas in my brain if I don't consume them in that form. And so absorption is everything,
Yeah.
because if these nutrients don't get into your tissues, then they can't do the good that you took them to produce in the first place.
Mm.
So eating a well-balanced diet, that's number one. I have friends who will say your abs are made in the kitchen. They're right, but I still like my bread, so I got a little floof. Sorry, it's like can't get over the fact that I love sourdough. It's just
Yeah.
gonna keep with me. But I do take a multivitamin. I take one that is essentially food-based, meaning that the nutrients are extracted from food, and that may mean they're not as potent, right? So like, for instance, vitamin C, you can go and you can get a vitamin C, it's 500 milligrams or super cheap at Costco, and just
Right.
trust that it's being absorbed into your system. Or you can take a vitamin C that's actually extracted from amla or gooseberry, or a vitamin C that's taken from kiwi. And you can create supplements that contain these food sourced vitamins and have a much better chance at absorbing the nutrients. They're not going to cost the same amount because it can't. It takes more to make them from food. And you really just think about it from that point as being supplement to a healthy diet, supplement to a healthy lifestyle. And you might spend $1 a day for that high quality multivitamin, but it won't just end up in the toilet.
Yeah. Absolutely. That was a lot. Really good stuff. So, for those, I think we've given everyone a ton of things to think about. But for those listening, and I'm very curious. Like, I have two questions. So, I want to talk about your product and what you created. But I'm curious, how does algae fit into the world of being carbon neutral in terms of, because I know sustainability is really big to you, and like even your packaging and all that. Like, we can talk through all of that, and then
Right.
we'll kind of wrap up there. But let's
Well,
handle
if you
that.
think about algae, algae is
Yeah.
actually the first life form on this planet. And we're harnessing
Mhm.
the potential of that first plant, the microorganisms, a single-celled algae that are using the benefit of photosynthesis light
Mhm.
and ultimately creating their nutrients from that, right?
Yeah.
And so we're using photosynthetic algae, which means that we can actually feed them things like carbon, which plants need to consume in order to release oxygen and light, and a mix of only the nutrients they need in a closed environment. And the reason that this is important is because we can dictate all of the inputs. We can make sure that there aren't pollutants or other algae strains coming in that don't produce the nutrient that we want, or amoebas or beetles that like to consume algae, right? So we're not
Right.
growing in open ponds, we're growing actually in a photobioreactor, which is super high tech, but ultimately just showing the algae the light that it needs to thrive, which is a perfect mix of blue and red light. People can take a peek at this by visiting orlonutrition.com and actually see images of our photobioreactor. And
Cool.
so we grow in this kind of vertical farming perspective, and these tubes, we're bubbling carbon through it. And because we're co-located next to a geothermal plant that harnesses the energy of the planet to create power, we're only using green energy and we're feeding it carbon. And so in the process of doing that, we're creating a byproduct of oxygen while also creating omega-3s from one particular algae strain, an ultra spirulina from another, which is spirulina technically is a cyanobacteria, but it's also
Yeah.
photosynthetic and lumped into the world of algae. So we grow
Hmm.
spirulina. The spirulina produces the same protein structure that you see in beef, but of course is completely vegan. So long
Yeah.
term, we'll likely have a protein product. Um, but it also produces vitamin B12. And so by growing algae and the way that we're growing it in these closed systems, we're able to produce a product that can be minimally processed to preserve its sensitive nutrients in the polar lipid form, or in the case of the spirulina, actually retain its vitamin B12 in its methylated form. Interestingly,
Yeah.
spirulina grown in open ponds doesn't produce that form of vitamin B12.
Interesting.
So it's like just by giving the algae everything it needs to thrive, it's giving us its most bioavailable
Mhm.
nutrients. We're able to
Yeah.
minimally process that product because of how it's grown and
Mhm.
ultimately harness its omega-3 potential, the other micronutrients that are there, including chlorophyll. So like if you were to puncture one of our capsules of our product and squirt it into a glass of water, it will actually turn the water green from the chlorophyll, right?
Cool.
And
Yeah.
unlike a standard fish oil, this little soft gel that you see here, unlike a standard fish oil, if you were to mix it up in the water, you see like little beadlets form and the water turn green. Oil and water don't tend to mix, but if you were to
Hmm.
do that with ours, it integrates more, and that's because of the polar lipids. If you were to do the same thing with a
Okay.
fish oil, it's going to float right on the top. That's actually
Yeah.
part of the reason people tend to get that fishy burp from
Sure.
taking
Yeah.
a run-of-the-mill algae oil, which doesn't have
Mm-hmm.
the polar lipids, or a fish oil product.
Got it. Okay. Very cool. And I know all of your packaging, like it comes in glass bottles that are reusable, right? And
Yeah, I mean, one of
yeah.
the major things we did because I got involved early on, I was able to make the judgment call to say, look, we want to really showcase the sustainability of this product. We need to select materials that are going to be the most mindful. So I
Hmm.
worked with Eco Enclose, which is a shipping materials company. Like they create all the packaging that you might ship a product in to create a post-consumer recycled box. It's 100% post-consumer recycled with an algae-based ink. They only make the algae-based ink in black. And so when I worked to create the brand, I said, well, what if we did monochrome and just did black and
Yeah.
white? Because we know we
Yeah.
can use black ink from algae that's taken from waste stream algae that is grown for human nutrition to go ahead and also replace another petro product, right? You don't have to
Okay.
use carbon black, which is a petrochemical ink. We can use it
Hmm.
from algae as a byproduct, and now it's still sequestering carbon, and it's even safe to use in my compost. I can recycle it again if I want, or I can tear it up and use it as brown matter in my compost.
Amazing.
So yeah, it's something else you can do with
Very
it.
cool.
The
Yeah.
bottle is reusable many times. It's made of Miron violet glass, which is black.
Hmm. Hmm.
It doesn't allow light through unless you shine a bright, bright light through just the edge and it looks kind of cobalt. That protects the
Hmm.
soft gels inside. You could even just have this
Hmm.
on your counter in your bathroom or your kitchen so you remember to take it every day. And then we're doing a subscription model. So the product actually ships in these pouches that are made of post-consumer recycled plastics with one layer of virgin plastic, because that's what you have to do in order to touch a food supplement.
Right.
But ultimately, this is still recyclable and
Hmm.
can live after this second life that it's in already, a third or fourth time in another form. And ultimately, everything that we do is focused on trying to limit our carbon. People who buy from our website using ShopPay, it's automatically got a carbon credit to take care of the shipping. And we ship only via ground from our centrally located warehouse, which is in Texas, to ensure that the carbon footprint is as little as possible.
Yeah. Very cool. So how can I know you said the website already, orlonutrition.com. Is that the best place for people to go to just kind of? connect with you, learn more? I know you've got like lots of platforms. You've got two
Yeah,
podcasts actually.
so they
So
can start there at
yeah.
orlonutrition.com. We actually have the podcast Nutrition Without Compromise hosted on the site. So you can find it
Mhm.
wherever you listen to podcasts, but you can also explore the podcast page on our website and dig into past episodes. There are many, many shows to pick from, and ultimately, it's a resource for you. The shows are produced in video and audio format, and we include complete transcripts on the page as well. So for those that might be hearing impaired, they can read the content. It's organized as a blog with pictures and, little titles here and there, so that it breaks up the content a bit too. Most episodes are 30 to 45 minutes. There are some that are a little longer, like my conversation with Melanie Plourde, who I mentioned just a bit ago, talking about polar lipids and omega-3 to omega-6 balance, and those who might be of a different genome type. So we get a little techie in some of them, but ultimately it's great information and a resource to continue someone's ongoing continual education, specifically as it relates to nutrition and great health without compromising your ethics or the health of planet Earth.
Love it. Awesome. Um, and for those listening, if you decide you want to test this out, try it. I think we've got a special code for everyone
Yes,
I
we
can
will
put in
give
the
an
show
extra
notes.
10% off to anybody who visits the site and uses the code DRAlex for Dr. Alex 10. DRAlex 10 will get you an extra 10% off. We're presently running a promo on the site through the end of the year that will actually allow you to get our holiday bundle, which includes both the omega-3 product of your choice and our immunity boost with ultra spirulina at a 27% discount already. So theoretically, they could go and get almost 40% off by buying the product today.
Yeah.
And that bundle ships free. We're not charging shipping on that bundle. So it's a
Okay.
great way to try the products that we have to offer. And then you can always subscribe to whichever products you choose to continue using. Our subscription customers get 15% off ongoing on their shipments as well.
Well, Marina, thank you so much. I learned a lot from this, so I hope it benefits
Well,
everybody else. And
I hope
you
so
know,
too. I would
yeah.
love to be able to come back and dive more deeply into how omega-3s impact your hormones. One thing I
Mhm.
didn't share is I actually, I'm 46, so I'm starting the whole menopause journey, kind
Okay.
of. My periods are now getting erratic, and also happen to have hypothyroidism. And so
Mhm.
we could talk about how omegas can impact these systems.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So I think we're gonna have a part two. We'll just once we stop
Thank
recording,
you so much for what you do. I love the show. I really
yeah,
do.
yeah. Thank you. Thank you for being here.